and thanks for that introduction. Absolutely clear. I think, as you say, there's kind of three main drivers really. It's operational efficiency, the cybersecurity elements and governance elements associated with third parties, and actually just trying to drive growth within businesses by being able to interact with more third parties. And there's a few kind of elements around skills gaps and things like that that I'll kind of share my thoughts on, which is why this has become more relevant. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Phil Allen. I'm based in the UK, and I look after the Sexetta business here in Europe. I've been in the identity industry for 22 years now, through from whether it's PKI, web access, user administration and provisioning as it was, identity governance. I previously ran the One Identity business, and then subsequently for the last kind of 6 years have been at Ping Identity, again back on the access management. So and this has kind of been an area around third parties that I think has just been overlooked in the identity industry for a little while, and it's become more and more relevant now. So and kind of, you know, I think if we think about what we try to look at from a cybersecurity perspective, we understand that insider risk is a really important piece that needs to be covered. I think people, you know, are spending as much time trying to manage insider risk, all of the elements we're looking at, a separation of duty management, the onboarding, offboarding of people, making sure that we're running a zero trust environment, or at least an element of least privilege within our areas. That's really understood for our employees, and we know the processes for our joiner, mover, leaver, and processes associated with those employees. But what do we do if that insider isn't in fact an employee? Can we turn around and have confidence that we've got the same level of understanding as to who those people are, what access they should have, the recertification elements that are associated with it, if they're not an employee? And if we think about the businesses, there's a huge amount that is coming through now. A recent Gartner report, and I've cited the links through to these reports so people can look at them afterwards. The median organization has around 5,000 third-party organizations that they work with. Now, not all of those will need IT access, but whether that's, if you're thinking about supply chain elements, you're thinking about agents that may be working as part of a business, you're thinking of IT contractors that are coming in and working in an organization, accountants that may need to get access to systems. There could be a huge number of different third parties that are needing to come in. And most GRC leaders are expecting that number to increase, you know, over this year, and I suspect it'll carry on increasing. And we also know, as Martin kind of alluded to at the beginning, that there's a huge amount of breaches that have ended up occurring due to third parties, and the amount of data that's been lost associated with that. And again, Gartner's report said that 44% of companies had experienced a significant data breach. I mean, that is an incredible number when we actually think about it. And again, you know, if down the bottom, Deloitte said that over the last 3 years, there has been some type of third-party incident that's affected 83% of organizations that are out there, either from a financial perspective or reputation perspective. So this is a massive issue, and it's only an issue that's going to get more and more prevalent as we start working with more and more third parties. And even if we just look at this quarter of this year, this is an example of some of the known third-party breaches that are out there, that have occurred, some well known, different types of uses of third parties that have come through. So, you know, people who've been in the medical industry, people who are looking at this from a service desk outsourcing, hardware contractors, payment processors, lots of different types of third party. And whilst some of the data that's going to get lost can't necessarily, it can't all be solved through an identity management element. It does highlight the need that we have to understand who are the third parties that have access to the data that's coming through in our environment, and how are we going to make sure that we can control those. But it's the reason this is going to continue more and more is there's this massive skills gap in everything that's happening. We're working with a Dutch company at the moment, and they've turned around and said they have no way of getting the number of people that they need to get trained up for their expansion. The only way they're going to be able to get those people is by going out to third parties that already have those skilled people and being able to work with those. And if you turn around and say nearly 90% of companies have actually turned around and said they either have a current skills gap or they're about to have a skills gap, this affects pretty much every organization that is out there. And it's going to be staff augmentation or third parties that are going to be the only way of managing some of the economic challenges that are going to be faced by this. And so if we're thinking about this at a high business level, it's not just the IT people who are having to deal and work with this. This is a business problem that is going to end up being solved by introducing more third parties into the organization. And it's going to be the identity management professionals and the security professionals that are going to need to make sure that the processes are in place to manage those correctly. And there's a lot of numbers and money associated with these skills gaps. And I think that's going to, like I say, that's going to become a really good way for us to be able to have a conversation with some of the business leaders that we're working with, but it's also going to highlight some of the challenges that we have to deal with. And then I think there's just a generational change that's happening. So they're saying that expecting over the next 5 years, over 50% of the US workforce will become freelancers or contractors. And now some of these are going to be people working in what would be classified as the gig economy, but I think we've all seen as working from home has become a much more natural thing for organizations to understand. It's been forced upon us over the last 2 years. It then comes a question, if I'm going to have people who aren't coming into the office every day, do I actually need those people to be permanent employees? Or actually, does that make it even more opportunistic for me to be able to work with contractors or other third parties out there, and I don't necessarily even have to have permanent employees all of the time? And so that's certainly something that's being seen in North America, and I think there's going to be socioeconomic elements that mean that'll probably end up happening across our region as well. And even by the end of last year, if we think about just our industry around IT outsourcing and the different people, it's something we've been working with for years. That actually was $400 billion market, and it's expected to increase. So this is a massive business area around outsourcing. And again, just if we look at the financial services industry, their help desks are outsourced. We know from people in our own industry some of the challenges that can come if a third party goes rogue from an outsourced perspective or from a help desk perspective. It can have massive implications on the reputation and ultimately the value of an organization. So if we're thinking about these, when we're bringing the people on board and we're bringing trusted third parties on, can we be confident that we know that the actual individuals that are accessing our systems are the individuals that we want? And how do we know? What processes have we got in place that allow us to make sure that we haven't got people who are sharing accounts, we haven't got people who have excessive privileges from a third-party perspective? We've got an element of recertification that's going on, or revalidation, that those people should still have access. And as Martin said, if we've got delegated administrators who are coming in, how do we make sure that when someone leaves, we take away that account so that we're not wasting IT resources on that? And similarly, we haven't got people who are unnecessarily creating new accounts for external third parties that they can then allow a rogue or a bad actor to get access to. But it's not just human elements in here as well. One of the things I want to cover is managing the concept of non-employees and robotic processes and the automation associated with that actually just acts as another non-employee. So we've got the non-human element as well as managing those third parties. And there's been a massive proliferation of robotic processes, and they don't always follow the same joiner, mover, lever process as you would have in place. I know there's some really good processes that people have where a manager has to have ownership of the robotic processes that they look after, but that isn't always the case. And I suspect of organizations yourselves who have robotic processes that sit outside of the employee joiner, mover, lever process and potentially open up gaps in the security if people are trying to implement a zero trust security model. So fundamentally, this is what we're trying to cover. We know that identity is the new perimeter, but we need to make sure that if we understand that, we've got the controls that are in place that allow us to manage all of the other identities that we have in play today. So when we're talking about this, what we've seen talking in industry, some of the common challenges that we're seeing coming through is around audit findings, Sarbanes-Oxley requirements that may have an understanding why particular contractors have access. I think people are good at getting people onboarded sometimes, but it's not always the same when a contractor leaves that somebody takes that responsibility of getting them out of the organization. We know that there's been a huge amount of breaches associated with third parties. We also know that people are potentially sharing accounts because it's difficult for them to get access. They want to bring somebody new on as an independent financial advisor or something, and it's difficult for them to get access to those resources. As identity management professionals, we may have to link through to 30 different Excel spreadsheets where we're trying to pull different bits of data through for our external users, so it's not easy for us to run our GRC components associated with it. Vendor attestation doesn't always happen, or it becomes really complicated. And fundamentally, it just gets to a point where things are inefficient and it takes too long to get people onboarded. All of these are very common challenges that we're seeing in the industry when it comes to third parties. And I think it's been really well addressed, both on the consumer or customer side and on the employee side. But this business to business or third party element has been left out in the cold a little bit. So if we think about all other identities, we've got a really good understanding of what happens on the employee side, I think, today. That's been well known for the last 20 years. And I think really for the last 5 or 6 years, the customer elements have been covered really well as well. So on the employee side, we've got the SailPoints, the Savients, the One Identities of the world, the Oracles, IBMs still, the Microsoft elements that have got a really good covering on that employee side. And on the customer side, whether it's Auth0 now, Okta, ForDrop, Ping, etc. Again, there's a really good understanding of how to manage customer identity management well. But there's a whole heap of other identities that sit in there, either third parties that we're covering, business agents and business partners that we work with, individuals that may not sit as an employee, like students in a university or in a hospital, researchers that are coming through, residents, if we're thinking about it in house sharing elements, lots of different individuals, and then non-human identities, bots, RPAs, service accounts, devices, that all need to be managed and typically aren't managed within an identity management system today. Some are managed in the likes of ServiceNow and other ITSM strategies, but so that typically relates to the non-human side first, and some people are using those as ticketing systems to come in for individuals. But this is really what we're seeing as all of the other identities that need to be managed. And if we think about today what we're doing and we're seeing with digital identities, it's understanding that what, when, and how that identity is interacting with us. But one of the other questions that needs to get asked is the why element of this. So who is actually turning around and saying, we've got this individual who is coming through into our environment and is then going to be interacting with all of the digital processes that we've got going downstream. So fitting in with our existing IGA solutions, our existing directories, our existing privilege management systems that we've got in place. And we turn around and say, why is it that we have got that identity coming through? Why have they got this access? Why does things change associated with access? And why is it treated in the way that it needs to be treated? And if we can provide that intelligence around those third parties, we can then feed into all of the existing processes that sit in place today around the IGA solutions, around your privilege management solutions and access management, to make sure that we're acting as that authoritative source of information in the same way as you're using an HR system today for managing your employees. So Sexeter ends up having a huge amount of different interactions that's covering through. It's about having third-party administrators. So these can be both internal and external people that are managing those identities and saying that they need to be onboarding and offboarding a particular identity. You've got the internal owners within an organization, the sponsors. We're working with a German company, and I like the fact they use the term the godfathers. Each person has to have a godfather if they're an external. So one of those internal people who's looking after and managing them. But then you've also got interactions with other systems like vendor management systems or your HR systems. So Sexeter's taking that feed, is looking at those identities, is running the profile management associated with those identities. And it is then managing to cover off things like identity proofing, understanding what the relationship needs to be, providing a self-service portal for those identities, but is then feeding down to all of the existing elements of the identity management solution that's in place today. And I think it's important to say, third-party identity management, and what we're talking about here, isn't about replacing anything that's in place today. There may be some homegrown systems, there may be spreadsheets that we're wanting to be looking to replace. But fundamentally, we're talking about something that is sitting on top of the existing infrastructure, is complementing that. And I think that's been highlighted by the fact that some of the IGA vendors are actually the biggest people that are proposing our solution into their customers at the moment, because they're seeing challenges with trying to manage this through their own environment. We are an add-on to the existing infrastructure to be able to provide better functionality than is being met today. And we have to be able to integrate with that existing technology. So yes, we want to become that authority for all other identities. And we're taking those feeds in from third-party risk management systems, from vendor management systems, governance GRC systems like RSA Archer, processing that information, doing risk scoring associated with it from what we know, making sure that we've got the identity proofing done, and then feeding down to those target systems that are sitting below that. And we've been able to do that with, pretty much, I would say, the vast majority of the main technologies that we work with today. So on the identity side, I think most of the names there are ones that we'd all recognize, that we've done those integrations with from the downstream side. And then, we already have feeds potentially with some of the upstream systems, but there's probably some other ones in there like Fieldglass that people aren't used to dealing with today. So for us, making sure that we've got those integrations with that existing technology becomes really relevant. Otherwise, we just become another manual process. I met with an automotive manufacturer last week, and today all of this was being done using one identity, but being done in a manual manner. And it was actually being done by the identity teams. And one of the reasons they wanted to put in a new solution was on top of one identity, was so that that can be delegated out not only to the line of business owners, but also to the third parties themselves. And they weren't in a position to be able to open up their administrative interface of one identity to those third parties and provide them that access, because that's covering internal role management. And they didn't feel that that was straightforward enough for them to be able to provide that information through to those third parties. So that's the layer that we're looking to provide in between. But it's also about managing risk. So we understand about managing the identities, but we want to be able to make informed decisions about what's changing. So if something happens from a geopolitical system, and one of our customers is a large hotel chain, and as part of the conflict that occurred, that's occurring, they had to close down their establishments, or at least put in a disconnect of any establishments that existed within Russia, and take those people out of those systems. Managing that type of franchise becomes really complicated because they're an agent in so them having a system that then allows, when there's a geopolitical change, changing the risk profile associated with all of those individuals, and having a single place that they can go to and say, we need to now change everything, all of the access associated with these accounts, and then have their IGA and provisioning solution deprovision or deactivate all of those accounts immediately, was a massive saving for them, and enabled them to be able to close off corporate functions very, very quickly to what were fundamentally third parties coming into their organization. But it's also making sure you're doing background checks, not only of the companies, but the individuals that are coming through it. Procurement and VMS systems are managing the background checks associated with the companies typically, but what about the individuals that are sitting within there? We saw that in our own industry with some things that happened earlier on this year, that were well documented, of what happens when you get somebody who potentially has poor credit, who's prepared to allow somebody to come in and use those accounts. You want to be able to understand that, and if you did those background checks on the individuals, not just on the accounts, before you're allowing that access, when you've got third parties who are bringing in lots of different people into call centers and service centers, that's something that you want to be able to manage. But if you're looking at third parties, for specific projects, it doesn't mean that every single one of those is going to be the same, have the same level of risk. So we want to be able to manage the vendor themselves, and using the vendor management systems or our own elements, we can provide a risk score for that particular third party. We will then look at the individuals that come through from them, and based on the things that they're trying to do, we would automatically assign them with the same risk score that we've given that organization. But if we're then actually starting to do things like background checks, understand their geolocation, understand whether they've got the right certifications, done the right training, we actually might assign different risk scores to each of the individuals that sit within that third-party organization. So we've given the vendor a low risk score, but certain individuals that come through who may be need to access different systems from our side, or come through with a different background, we might end up assigning a different level of risk score associated with them. We will then pass that through to the provisioning solution, who will determine which systems they are and which systems they're not allowed. We may introduce multi-factor authentication for some, not for all. We may say if someone's coming from a particular individual and they're coming through from a different access location, then they have to have a different authentication method. The standard type of risk-based approach that we're looking to do. But today, this is typically being done at a VMS level, the vendor management solution level, only at a vendor, and not necessarily at the individuals that are sitting within that. So managing the risk associated with the identity is also very, very relevant. And as Cartman would say, you've got to make sure that your authority is always being respected. And I think one of the challenges that we've seen from a third-party perspective is that there isn't an authority. And if you haven't got that authoritative source, then you can't provide effective delegation of administration, because you've got people coming in lots, having to provide data in lots of different places. One GDPR one that we were asked the other day was, if a contractor leaves you or a third-party supplier terminates the contract with you, how confident are you from a GDPR perspective, if they exercise their right to be forgotten, that you would know every single location that that person's identity sits? And we were actually talking to a contractor at the time about that, and they were saying there's no way. He said, I already know that I reside in different spreadsheets, in different databases, some of which are synced manually, some of which are synced automatically into our IGA solution, but there is no central location of where all of the contractors sit. So we've got people who almost certainly should have been terminated that haven't. We've got certainly people where we've got personal or sensitive information that may reside associated with these people, and we haven't got that authoritative source. We don't know where that information sits. It's difficult to put an empowerment process in place for the business users, and therefore the burden of managing this tends to sit on the identity side. And again, you just don't get that centralized view of non-employee identities in the same way as you do with an HR system. And again, you know, those of you who've tried to integrate your non-employees into an IGA solution, you know how challenging it is to have to manage all of these different ones. So one question we get asked is, well, why can't we just use the HR system for this? Well, I think if we actually think about it, firstly, there are lots of different elements associated with the HR system, which means that it's not ideal for this. It doesn't cover risk ratings. It's not designed to manage some of those complex workflows. It's not project related, so it doesn't know when a project finishes that all of the people associated with that project should automatically have their accounts suspended. And also, just the HR department typically want to own that and don't necessarily want to provide delegated administration out to a third-party organization into their HR environment. So it becomes quite challenging to actually turn around and say that this should become your authoritative source. We'll work really closely with the HR, and in fact, we would actually turn around and say, this sits typically with the identity people, but bringing in the business sponsors either from a line of business manager or from an HR solution, because they will own a lot of the processes associated with managing these third parties. They have to be a part of this program somewhere, but it's typically not the right solution using an HRMS to manage these third parties. And especially if people want to bring in non-human elements, the robotic process elements, then having an identity authority that's going to cover all of these non-employee components is going to be a much better process for you. And fundamentally, you know, it is about different real-world problems. So whether it's, you know, we're seeing a lot of areas in hospitals where you've got insurance companies coming through, you've got locums and people moving from one hospital location to another, temporary staff, you've got people who are both students and doctors associated with that. So there's a huge diverse life cycle element in there. In global conglomerates and large manufacturings, again, you've got real challenges both with supply chains, with a number of individuals that are coming through, from outsourcing components through robotic process elements that are being put in place, from actual robots that are working, that are needing much more access. So this is a real challenge that we're seeing across all industries. And certainly from our side, the big areas has been healthcare, manufacturing, franchise elements, supply chain and the retail association associated with that. Things like clinical trial testing in the pharmaceutical space, as well as then government and financial services, which is where a lot of us are used to dealing already. So real challenges associated with it. And even if you just think about one example that I'm sure most people understand, which is an M&A scenario today, you do an acquisition, you want to be able to get those people onboarded straight away, but they're sitting in a completely separate environment. Well, if you can put a third-party process in place and get those people onboarded immediately into that third party, you can start to get the benefit of using some of the centralized IT systems before you've been able to actually run through all of the interactions and the consolidation of the different IT resources that you want to do down the line. You can get those people working and being effective immediately. And that's just a really straightforward use case that I think we're used to seeing all of the time today. So again, for us, keeping it simple, having it so that externals can get access to things, internal people can approve and manage those, make sure that people have got the right revalidation steps, make sure that people have added in the right levels of certification that's needed, and then be able to provide a risk score that's associated with that. If someone can put that in place today and then tie that in with the automation that is already in place, it's going to provide a much better experience. It's going to get rid of some of the work that the identity team are having to do today, and it's going to overall provide a much greater cybersecurity space. But none of this should be done unless you're doing identity proofing of those third parties as well. The different elements around managing the people coming in and making sure you really do know who they are. It's been a real valuable lesson that we've all learned over the last 2 years. How do we onboard people if we can't see them face to face? But I think this aspect of identity proofing is a real key area in the zero trust element that you want to put in place for those third parties. So I just kind of wanted to put this here so you can get a picture of how this will work in your environment. So we can be taking feeds in from VMS, from manual processes, through automated processes, through delegated administration. But you should see this third-party solution pretty much sitting alongside where you see your HR environment today. It's not replacing any of the IGA elements or the access management systems that are sitting below. It's sitting alongside that, and it is acting as that identity authority for those contractors, affiliates, RPA elements and processes that are in place, the contingent workforce that you've got coming through, being that identity authority for all of those other identities. So this is really where it would sit within an environment today. And I hope that that gives a good view of it. So, my line here is, if your current strategy doesn't include the management of all of those other identities, then now's the time to make that change, look at it, think about what you could do differently, and look to kind of refine that strategy. So I hope that gives people a bit of an overview of the way we're thinking about managing third parties. Martin, I'll kind of hand back to you and see what kind of questions we've or thoughts that has provoked for people.
Yes, so we got a couple of good questions. There was a request for a demo, but I don't know if we will have time for that. I think
probably not. I'm probably not the right person for that in any case. What I will say is we have actually got some products. We've got some product tours, so we can arrange demos if someone wants that. So kind of drop me a line. But you can actually go through a product tour online anyway and just kind of click through and see what that looks like for anybody.
So I think that was a really good question. There was a question about how you sit between the identity and the federation products, and I guess that you can integrate into either to feed into the identity layer, or if you don't have an independent identity layer, you can feed straight into the Azure AD or
yeah. So we've got and from technology partnerships, so we've got technology partnerships with all of the IGA providers and all of the access management providers themselves directly, and in fact, got a few sort of tri-party elements that are working alongside there as well. So yeah, if you don't have that IGA solution and you just want to feed straight into your federation, your access management solution, or straight into another directory because you're then running other processes from there, then we can manage that integration.
Maybe Sorry, can I elaborate a little bit on that one, Martin? Do we have time for that?
Okay.
Phil, thank you for the explanation. So one of the customers that I'm working together with is struggling with let's say the B2B collaboration model that for example Microsoft especially adopts, where you can easily bring in guest identities and make sure that they use and provide access. So we want to go away from or get away from the identity provisioning part, separate the partner identities from the customer's identities. And managing those identities is really a headache because you don't have an authoritative solve for that, or you need to go to the IDP of the partner itself.
Yep.
And Sexeta can also step in there and add value, right? That's
correct.
Just to double check. Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
So one question I had, access recertifications, that's done inside of Sexeta?
No, the access recertification itself, we would recommend follows your current recertification process at an individual level. The profile recertification and validation. So, should that individual still be, do they still work at that vendor, that third-party vendor, and should they still be working, for example, on this project? Should they still have the access that we think that they should have? At that level, Sexeta can manage that. Now, the actual individual access recertification that happens, should they have access to all of these different systems? And that typically is then going to the internal system owners. And we would typically see that would follow the same IGA process, that same recertification process as you have in place for the employees when you're going down to the application owners themselves. So I think one way to look at this is when we bring someone in from external, let's say they're working on a project and that project has either a finite life or will just terminate when that project actually finishes. We don't know exactly when that's going to be. That level of validation, should that third-party identity still have access to our systems and should be a part of this profile, those are the bits that we manage. The bits that you would expect your application owners to do at the back end, and that recertification would be done through your current IGA tool.
Makes sense. So one thing I've had discussed with some people in the industry is that one of the things you could do to make that identity recertification more valuable would be to lift in things like, for example, has this identity logged into your Azure AD, whatever you have, for the last 6 months? Because what we often see is that the business owners tends to go like yes. And if you would provide that type of feedback, that are you really sure that you want to do this because this person has not logged in for the last 6 months?
Yeah.
Is that something you're seeing amongst your customers as well?
Yeah, and in fact, when I talk about that risk score element, Martin, that would be exactly what the type of feed that we would bring in as part of that risk score. So let's say you've got an individual who has not authenticated, maybe they're authenticating, 3 times a week or once a week or whatever it is, and then suddenly they're not authenticating at all for 45 days, 60 days. There could be very good reason for that, but that also could be a flag that individual no longer works at that third party. And that could be the type of information that we would say that will then increase the risk score associated with that particular individual. That increase in risk score might automatically cause us, to restrict some of the access to their downstream systems, so that you suddenly haven't got this live account sitting there, or it could just trigger an alert that goes through to either a line of business manager internally or an external third-party manager for them to turn around and say, actually, does this person still work here and should they still have this access? So those are exactly the type of trigger points that we should be bringing in that affect what we see as the risk score for that third-party identity.
Makes sense.
And the same applies with RPA accounts and things like that. Nothing worse than having an RPA account or a service account which typically have relatively high privileges or often do. And if they're not actually doing anything and they're just sitting there dormant, there's actually been, starting to be a bit of a rise of people commandeering those identities and doing something with it. So again, that Those dormant elements are the ones that we really want to knock out quick.
So another function that is a bit similar that I've seen a bit in the US primarily is that you leverage externalized identities, so from a digital certification, digital IDs, to make sure that the person you think is a person actually is the person. Because especially in the US, there seems to be an increase in fraud, where one person goes to the interview and then another person actually works for you. And because, of course, remote working, you're not entirely sure who that is.
Yeah, so the digital proofing, the identity proofing is one thing that we want to be doing initially. I mean, I would say that is our primary element that we want. Because we're not doing that authentication every single time that's going through, the authentication process that's coming into your system, that is something, so your access management solution needs to be ensuring that the person, it needs to be ensuring that we're happy with the authentication process. So have the IP address changed, and is there something that we want to be doing to kind of further enforce that authentication element? That's what we would see to be done there. But the initial identity proofing, knowing who the person is, getting them to have their photos, speak into the cameras, checking against their driving licenses, other documentation that they've got, uploading the right certificates that they need to show that they're skilled enough to come and do the role. Those are the types of elements that we're looking to manage.
Makes sense. Any other questions?
Yeah, I do have one, Gaten, here. Thanks, first of all, Phil, for presenting this. It seems a really cool tool, but I'm still struggling to understand where to fit your platform in the identity access management domain. You mentioned that, I mean, it seems that what your tool can do, it's something that we can kind of cover with a good combination of an IGA solution and a PAM solution. Or even better, there are some PAM vendors that already have something that a kind of vendor access, right? With a proper combination, like I mentioned, of an IGA solution, right, that connects to the PAM and provides right access to the external users, third party. So how can I? Yeah, I'm struggling to understand how can I fit that.
And it's a great point. and in fact, when I first looked at this, I asked exactly the same questions. So certainly, could you build all of this yourself using an IGA tool? The answer to that is yes, you could. Are organizations doing it? No, they are not. But it could be built through, lots of different elements of whether it's ServiceNow or and an IGA tool, but people are not doing it. And I think if we look at IGA elements that have occurred today, the majority, people are still not fully benefiting from their IGA solution on the employee side, and they've still got a lot of work and projects associated with that. So they're typically overlooking that non-employee element. If we think about vendor access management, and I know the PAM solution that you're talking about, we're actually working with them and partnering with them around that. So that will absolutely be managing the vendor access itself, but is not doing any of the elements around the onboarding of that vendor and taking the feeds through from the VMS solution. So when procurement turns around and says, we now have signed a contract with a new supplier and that supplier has 50 people coming through to it, we would be taking that feed and kicking off a workflow immediately that goes out to that third-party solution to say, can you now onboard, bulk on upload or manually onboard your external users? We will go through the approval checks of that internally. We would then use the vendor management, the vendor access management solution to actually do that authentication and some of that authorization element as they're going through using the passwordless approaches that they're taking. But they're not managing they're not doing the management element of it. They're doing the functional access management of it. So we sit above both the IGA solution and the privileged access management solution, which are either acting as the policy enforcement and decision points, or the ones that are doing the provisioning through to the internal systems. In the same way as you take a feed from your HR system into your IGA solution, you would take a feed from our third-party identity authority into your IGA solution as well. I hope that helps. And if not, I'd be really happy to talk through and can actually talk through with someone like Dennis van Beers and talk through, you know, where we see the two technologies working alongside something like a vendor management solution.
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions from anybody?
Well, I can ask another one. Do you have any? No, I'm not going to too much in details about that. I mean, this is a really it depends on the you know, to the customer, the complexity of the environment they have. Or I've seen customers they barely have external users. I've seen others that they have so much that I do agree with you that they kind of they have the tools to manage them, but they don't use the powerful of those tools to manage them in a proper way. And yeah, I've seen users being there for a long time without using anything, with just paying licenses and everything. Well, but the question, the really simple one, who are your competitors, just to understand a little bit in the market? Is that any competitor?
So
it seems a unique solution.
Say that the majority of the competition that we get through is through from homegrown solutions. So it is people that have tried to develop some type of process, usually using an ITSM ticketing system, some element of vendor management system, or something associated with their HR system that they're currently running through today. That's typically what we're seeing. So, you know, you can manage the vendors through Fieldglass, and people are trying to take some aspect of then ticketing through from that, and then feeding that down. That's the primary piece that we've seen. Plain ID has developed a partner aspect of their solution, so they're looking at that. You know, SailPoint has the NELM component within non-employee lifecycle management component within their technology, but the SailPoint team are also probably the largest team that are pushing forward Sexetta into some of their existing install base, because they understand, you know, some of the additional functionality that's needed in those large enterprises. So, you know, I don't think that today there is one single organization that's out there that we would say that's our number one competitor. There are pieces of technology that other people are using today, and really we have to make sure that we're providing, you know, additional value above what somebody's developing and growing themselves. And look, you know, Sexetta came out from an identity management consulting organization that was implementing IGA solutions, that saw every time they were doing this, they were having to customize something associated with the IGA solution that wasn't good for either the vendor or themselves. And that's really where the product developed from six years ago. So that was that's why that came through.
Good, thank you.
So we're on the last few minutes. I think we have time for one more question. If someone has anything.
I do have maybe a last one. Phil, when you started the presentation, you mentioned about the challenges that we currently have with, let's say, non-employee identities. If Sexetta provides, let's say, an alternative source for non-employees, and you hooking up to the regular IGA processes, in most cases, the existing challenges will remain, because the issues are not, at least what I have seen, is not related to the source, but basically how the join, remove, or leaver process has been executed within the organization itself.
Actually, I don't know if I have seen that. I think the automation from a JML process, once the IGA solution is in place, I think that automation of that JML process is good. But the feeds that are coming in, people don't necessarily know if someone is coming in from that particular feed. That then means I now need to give those people this access down below. And also, I now need to check when something's changed or when someone's left. So we are typically seeing that it's the business process that sits above the automation layer that is the problem. And that's what we're here to address. So getting them in the same way as you've got your HR JML elements that happen when someone comes in and someone leaves, and we're making sure we've got the right sort of certification that's happening there. That is the piece that isn't happening today on the non-employee side. The automation that happens downstream, if that is not in place, and if that's not in a good place, then that does also need to be addressed. And again, you know, we're working jointly on opportunities today, you know, with the likes of One Identity and the likes of SailPoint, around how we can go in, manage the third parties, and do the automation layer that's sitting below. But for people who've already got their IGA, their JML process well sorted on the employee side, this becomes a nice add-on for the non-employee components that aren't being done today. And we are seeing a lot of headache coming through from the identity professionals who are saying, it's really challenging for me to know where to connect to. GRC are coming to me saying, can we do the recertification? But I don't know where to connect to make sure I really can understand whether those third parties should still have access. And the labor is being done by the identity teams. And part of our goal is to be able to delegate that away from the identity teams so that that can actually be, a lot of that can be done by the line of business, and the identity teams can get on and do the bits that they want to do.
Okay, thank you very much.
No worries. Well, listen, thanks everybody. I really appreciate, Martin, you giving the opportunity to talk this through. I hope it's valuable. I hope it's something that people haven't necessarily thought of. It just gives a little bit of an idea that people can think about again. Great. Will you be either at Hilleview or at EIC this year? I will be at EIC. So Jason Good, who's on this call as well, we'll be at EIC I'll be there on the Tuesday and the Wednesday, and then flying to Gartner for the Thursday and the Friday. It was great that they're on at the same time. And then Jason will be staying on the Thursday, Friday at EIC, and then Colette will be at the Gartner event in London. So if anyone's there at either of those, love to shake hands, have a coffee, have a drink. Be great to see people. Sounds great. I wish everyone a happy day, and we will publish the recording on the YouTube channel in probably by tonight or so. Once. And if anybody wants, if anyone wants a copy of the presentation, then don't hesitate to drop me a line either through LinkedIn or pallen@sexzeta.com. You can drop me a line and I'll send it through. Thank you very much. Have a great day, everyone. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.